Michigan, 2003. A cold case once frozen in fear and silence has finally been solved. The victim, Kayla Morgan Whitfield, just 18, a high school senior with a bright smile and dreams of becoming a writer, working part-time as a barista to save for college. One night she vanished. Her car was found abandoned by the roadside, the keys still in the ignition, her purse untouched. Police searched. Rumors spread. Years passed with no answers. Only whispers of incompetence, corruption, and cover-ups. But now, after 2 decades, a shocking arrest has sent tremors through the quiet Michigan town. The key? A long-forgotten DNA sample, and a name no one expected. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the small town of Brookridge, Michigan, nestled between sprawling cornfields and quiet 2-lane highways, everyone knew everyone, or at least it felt that way. Life moved slow, the way small-town life often does. People left their doors unlocked, waved to each other at red lights, and filled the local diner on Sunday mornings like clockwork. But among all the familiar faces in town, one name evoked immediate warmth. Kayla Morgan Whitfield. At just 18 years old, Kayla was known as much for her intelligence as for her kindness. A senior at Northridge High School, she was the kind of student teachers remembered long after graduation. She excelled in her AP classes, especially English, where she nurtured a love for writing that had been present since childhood. Her journal was always nearby, stuffed in her backpack filled with poetry, short stories, and dreams too big for a town so small. But Kayla wasn't just a student. She worked afternoons and weekends at the Brewhouse Cafe, a cozy spot that doubled as a town hangout. Locals loved her quick wit and warm demeanor. She remembered customers' names, their favorite drinks, and often left them smiling with a casual, "Have a good one." Her coworkers described her as reliable and sharp, often covering shifts without complaint, juggling work and school with the quiet grace of someone beyond her years. Her parents, Grace and Dennis Whitfield, were proud of their daughter's independence. Grace was a middle school art teacher. Dennis worked maintenance at a local plant. They had raised Kayla to be grounded, but always encouraged her to reach higher. And she did. Her dream was to attend Northwestern University and become a journalist. She talked about telling real stories, shining light where no one else wanted to look. That dream, so full of fire and promise, was what kept her focused while her classmates worried about prom and parties. Kayla volunteered at the local animal shelter on Saturdays, and she tutored younger students struggling in school. Her best friend Tasha said Kayla had the kind of soul that made you feel safer, just being near her. She had a quiet but undeniable presence, often observing more than speaking, always listening more than she shared. She wasn't flashy, but people noticed her. Maybe it was the way she made others feel, seen, heard, important. Her room was lined with books, a collage of Polaroids on the wall, photos of her parents, friends, her dog Max, and a few snapshots from family road trips. Her favorite was a blurry shot of the Chicago skyline, taken during a school field trip. She said it reminded her of where she was going, not where she was from. By October 2003, Kayla was deep in her college applications. She spent late nights at the kitchen table, headphones on, fingers flying over the keys. Her essay about witnessing injustice in small towns had moved her guidance counselor to tears. She had it all mapped out. Northwestern, then an internship, maybe New York or DC one day. She was going places. Everyone knew it. But what no one could have known was that the clock was ticking. On a normal weeknight, no different from any other, Kayla would finish her shift at the cafe, hop into her rust-colored Honda Civic and head home. Maybe she'd light a candle, play some music, or finish her reading for English Lit. That's what should have happened. Instead, that night would be the last time anyone saw her alive. What could have possibly happened to a girl so loved in a town so small? October 17, 2003 was like any other chilly fall evening in Brookridge, Michigan. The town was starting to slow down for the night. Street lamps flickered on, windows glowed warmly behind drawn curtains, and the comforting hum of routine settled over the community. At the Brewhouse Cafe, the closing shift was wrapping up. Kayla Whitfield, dressed in her worn black hoodie and jeans, wiped down the last table before checking the clock. 8:13 p.m. She glanced out the front window at the nearly empty parking lot, then turned to her coworker Lisa with a tired smile. I've got to study for my lit exam. Catch you tomorrow? Lisa nodded and Kayla disappeared out the front door, her ponytail swaying behind her. What happened after that remains a mystery. Kayla never made it home. At 9:30 p.m., Grace Whitfield sent her daughter a quick text. "You home yet?" No reply. At 10:00 she called. Straight to voicemail. Dennis called next, then Tasha, then Lisa from the cafe. None had heard from Kayla since she left work. She wasn't answering, and that was unlike her, especially with a major exam the next day. By 11:00 p.m., Grace was behind the wheel, driving aimlessly through town. Her headlights swept across sidewalks and storefronts, searching for a sign, any sign of Kayla's car. Dennis stayed home, manning the phone and keeping watch in case Kayla walked through the door. Midnight passed. Still nothing. Then at 12:41 a.m., a call came from the county sheriff's office. A patrol car had spotted an idling vehicle on the shoulder of Clover Mill Road, near the outskirts of town. The engine wasn't running, but the hazard lights had blinked briefly before going dead. The officer ran the plate. It was Kayla's 1998 Honda Civic. By the time Grace and Dennis arrived at the scene, the area was cordoned off. Officers shined flashlights into the nearby brush while others photographed the scene. The car was locked. Her purse was sitting on the passenger seat untouched. The keys were inside. There was no blood, no shattered glass, no drag marks, no clear sign of a struggle, but the silence was deafening. Grace collapsed to her knees, sobbing, screaming her daughter's name into the empty trees. Dennis stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists. A parent's worst nightmare was unfolding second by second. Police asked the same questions over and over. Had Kayla ever run away before? Was she seeing someone her parents didn't know about? Had she been acting strangely? The answer was always the same, no. By dawn, search teams were mobilized. Flyers were printed. Volunteers began organizing. But without leads, without witnesses, without even a clear crime scene, they were already running uphill. Rumors quickly spread. Some said they'd seen a pickup truck parked along that same stretch of road earlier that evening. Others whispered about a man who had been asking strange questions at the gas station near the cafe. But nothing was verified, and then there was the unspoken fear, the one everyone felt, but no one wanted to say out loud. What if someone had been watching Kayla that night? What if it wasn't random? The town of Brookridge, where crime was rare and people still trusted their neighbors, was now a place of unease and unanswered questions. The disappearance of Kayla Whitfield had turned a quiet evening into the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. Had she run away? Or was someone watching her that night? By the third day after Kayla Whitfield's disappearance, Brookridge was holding its breath. Volunteers combed through nearby woods, fields, and trails in small teams. Churches organized prayer circles. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Strangers stopped each other in grocery stores, whispering updates or rumors they'd heard secondhand. Nothing felt normal anymore. The tight-knit Michigan town was beginning to unravel. On October 20th, a team of volunteers and K-9 units were dispatched to the outskirts of Wild Hollow Trail, a secluded area just beyond where Kayla's car had been found. At 3:47 p.m., one of the dogs alerted near a shallow embankment off the main path. There, caught in the underbrush and thick mud, was a black hoodie, ripped, stained, and unmistakably Kayla's. Her parents confirmed it on sight. Grace collapsed to the ground, screaming her daughter's name. Dennis held her as deputies moved them back. From that moment, hope began to give way to something darker. For 2 more agonizing days, search teams expanded the perimeter. Then, on October 22nd, another chilling discovery. Partially buried beneath layers of fallen leaves and moss, just 50 yards from the trail, they found Kayla's body. She was clothed, her hands bruised, fingernails chipped, signs she had fought back. A shallow grave had been hastily dug, a cruel attempt to hide what had been done. Investigators cordoned off the area, calling in forensic specialists from the state. The coroner's report would later confirm what many already feared: blunt force trauma to the head. A single devastating blow. There were also defensive wounds on her arms and signs of a violent struggle, but there were no indications of sexual assault. No murder weapon nearby, and perhaps most frustrating of all, no fingerprints, no tire tracks, no DNA left behind. The woods had swallowed every clue, and her killer had vanished without a trace. News spread quickly. Local radio stations broke the story that evening, and by morning, It was the front page of every paper in the state. Body of missing teen found in Brookridge woods. The reaction in town was immediate and raw. A candlelight vigil formed within hours outside Northridge High School. Students placed flowers, letters, and photos along the front steps. Kayla's locker became a memorial. Her desk sat empty, draped in her favorite scarf. The grief was sharp, but so was the fear. Residents who had once left bikes on lawns and doors unlocked suddenly changed their routines. Hardware stores reported a spike in sales of deadbolts and security cameras. Parents no longer let their children walk to school alone. The illusion of safety in Brookridge had shattered. Police ramped up their presence, questioning anyone who might have been on the trail that week. But with no credible witnesses, no surveillance footage, and no suspects, investigators quickly hit a wall. Grace and Dennis were left to plan their daughter's funeral with no answers, no justice, and no peace. Their only child had been taken, and the person responsible walked free, blending into the quiet streets like a ghost. The funeral was held 5 days later. Hundreds attended, some who didn't even know Kayla showed up, clutching candles and tissues. Her favorite song, Fields of Gold, played as her casket was lowered into the earth. As detectives reviewed evidence late into the night, the question loomed large and heavy. With so little evidence, how would police find her killer? In the days following the discovery of Kayla Whitfield's body, investigators from the Brookridge Police Department worked around the clock. The case had all the hallmarks of a targeted crime. She hadn't been robbed, hadn't been sexually assaulted, and her killer had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. But without physical evidence or a witness, detectives were left to follow the only leads they had, the people in Kayla's life. Her co-workers at the Brewhouse Cafe were the first to be questioned. Lisa, who had seen Kayla leave that evening, recalled nothing unusual. No strange customers, no one following her. Friends described her as upbeat in the days prior, focused on school and her college essays. She hadn't mentioned anyone new in her life. No secret meetings, no tensions. Kayla's ex-boyfriend, Justin Marlowe, was brought in early. They had dated for about a year, breaking up 6 months before her death. The split was mutual, according to both friends and Justin himself. He provided alibis, phone records, and willingly submitted to a DNA test. Nothing connected him to the scene. His prints weren't on the car. No witnesses placed him near the trail. The police cleared him within weeks. Kayla's phone was never found. Investigators believed that whoever killed her had likely taken it, or destroyed it, to prevent any digital breadcrumbs. Her laptop, retrieved from her bedroom, revealed nothing but essays, college applications, and playlists. There were no threats, no anonymous messages, no chat history that raised alarms. Authorities turned to nearby security cameras. Unfortunately, the small-town infrastructure worked against them. The cafe's outdoor camera had been broken for months. The gas station across the street didn't keep backup footage longer than 24 hours. By the time investigators looked, any potential clues had already been erased. Still, one piece of information haunted the early investigation. Multiple residents reported seeing a white pickup truck parked near Wild Hollow Trail the night Kayla vanished. One jogger claimed to have seen it idling without its lights, while another recalled passing it earlier that week. It seemed promising. Police canvassed dealerships and reviewed registered vehicles in the county, but nothing ever came of it. The lead faded into the long list of dead ends. Over the months that followed, the urgency dulled. Press coverage slowed. Tips dried up. The initial lead detective, Tom Callahan, kept the file open on his desk for years, returning to it whenever something new surfaced. But eventually, even he admitted to Kayla's parents that he was running out of options. When he retired in 2009, a new investigator briefly picked up the case, but momentum had long since faded. Files were boxed up, evidence was locked away. It became just another cold case. Every October, Grace and Dennis Whitfield held a candlelight vigil on the trail where their daughter was found. Each year the crowd grew smaller. Each year their questions remained unanswered. Grace wrote letters to state officials pleading for new resources, new technology, anything. Most went unanswered. Dennis, once hopeful, became quiet and withdrawn. Their home, once filled with laughter and ambition, sat in silence. As 2013 approached, the 10-year anniversary, Kayla's name had nearly vanished from public conversation. New tragedies had taken over headlines. The town had moved on, but her parents hadn't. They couldn't. The case was now labeled inactive, buried beneath stacks of other unresolved files. A promising life cut short, now reduced to dust-covered folders and fading memories. Still, somewhere deep inside, Grace held onto one belief. Someone out there knew the truth. Would anyone ever fight for justice again? By 2010, 7 years had passed since Kayla Morgan Whitfield vanished into the October night and was found buried in the woods days later. The town of Brookridge had returned to its slow rhythm on the surface, but beneath that quiet hum an unease lingered. The case had gone cold, but it had not been forgotten. At the Whitfield home, time stood still. Kayla's bedroom remained untouched. Her posters still clung to the walls, corners curling with age. Her favorite hoodie hung from the doorknob, and her journal, her last one, remained on her desk, open to a poem she never finished. Grace dusted the room every Sunday. Dennis rarely went in at all. Every year on October 22nd, the day her body was found, the townspeople placed roses along Wild Hollow Trail. Some did it silently and alone. Others gathered in groups, lighting candles and saying prayers. Students who had once shared classes with Kayla returned as adults to pay their respects. Teachers still spoke her name when they discussed writing assignments, quietly pointing to her legacy as a gifted storyteller. Yet beneath the surface of tribute and remembrance, suspicion quietly thrived. People still talked, though in lowered voices. Was it someone in town? Had Kayla known her killer? Why hadn't they been caught? Some even whispered that the original investigation had been flawed from the start. Rumors of mismanaged evidence and early suspects not fully vetted began to circulate. There were stories of key files being misplaced or potential leads never followed up on. The lead detective's retirement had seemed abrupt to some. For others, it was just the way these things went. Small-town departments often lacked the resources for long-haul investigations, but Grace never gave up. She wrote letters every year to the police chief, the state attorney general, even the governor, asking for the case to be re-examined. Sometimes she received a polite reply. Most times she didn't. Still, she never stopped asking. Then in 2019, something shifted. A new generation of investigators had begun combing through the cold case files statewide, prioritizing unsolved homicides involving young victims and preserved physical evidence. Michigan had begun allocating funding to support these efforts, quietly hoping that advancements in forensic technology could offer a second chance. Kayla's case landed on the desk of Detective Lauren Hendricks, a soft-spoken but fiercely tenacious investigator from a nearby jurisdiction who had recently joined a special cold case task force. Hendricks had grown up not far from Brookridge and vaguely remembered the media coverage when she was in high school. Now, nearly 2 decades later, she opened the weathered brown folder marked KMW-03 and began to read. What she found was frustrating, but not hopeless. The case files were disorganized, but evidence had been preserved. Kayla's clothing, the torn hoodie, soil samples, and even a small piece of duct tape found near her body had all been sealed and archived properly. New DNA extraction methods, unavailable back in 2003, offered possibilities no one had dared to hope for years earlier. Quietly, without public attention, the task force submitted the duct tape for retesting. It would take time, months, even a year. But the potential was real. Back in Brookridge, Grace received the news in a simple call from a young woman she'd never met. "My name is Detective Hendricks," the voice said gently. "I've reopened your daughter's case." Grace cried for the first time in years, not from grief, but from the flicker of something long buried. Hope. Could modern science do what years of detective work couldn't? The duct tape had sat sealed in an evidence bag for nearly 18 years, labeled, cataloged, and all but forgotten. Originally recovered from the leaves near Kayla Whitfield's shallow grave, it had seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't wrapped around her body, and no one could confirm if it had even belonged to the killer. In 2003, forensic tools were too limited to extract anything meaningful from it. But in 2021, technology had evolved. When Detective Lauren Hendricks reopened the cold case in 2019, she ordered all physical evidence to be reviewed by the state's forensic lab. She knew that even a single partial DNA profile could shift the tide. Of all the items re-examined, the duct tape stood out, not because of what it was, but because of where it had been found. just inches from the disturbed earth where Kayla had been, buried. Using a cutting-edge technique known as MVAC wet vacuum DNA collection, a method capable of extracting trace biological material from porous or degraded surfaces, technicians managed to pull a faint but viable, partial DNA profile from beneath the adhesive layer. It was male. The odds were still steep. Partial DNA wasn't always enough for a definitive match, but it was enough for the combined DNA index system, known as CODIS. The sample was uploaded to the national database. Then came the hardest part, waiting. Weeks passed. Then months. Hendricks returned to her usual caseload, but the Whitfield file never left her desk. Grace called regularly, sometimes just to talk. She'd learned not to ask for updates, she just wanted to know someone still cared. Then, nearly a year later, the breakthrough came. It didn't arrive with fireworks. No dramatic phone call. Just a quietly marked alert in the lab's tracking system. Familial match detected. The partial DNA hadn't hit a direct match in CODIS, but it had matched a close relative. A young man arrested in Ohio for a misdemeanor had submitted a DNA sample during booking, and that sample shared significant markers with the one from the duct tape. Forensic genealogists stepped in, constructing a family tree and narrowing down potential candidates. One name stood out, Marcus Dean Wallace. He wasn't in any prior reports, not listed as a suspect. He wasn't connected to Kayla's school, nor had he been flagged during early interviews. But when investigators ran a deeper background check, things got stranger. Wallace had lived in Brookridge in 2003. He'd worked odd jobs, yard work, minor construction, and occasionally volunteered with local cleanup efforts. He had no violent criminal record, nothing that screamed predator. In fact, after Kayla's murder, he had even helped put up missing posters during the early searches. There was a photograph in the case file, taken the day of the town's first vigil. In the background, barely visible, stood Marcus Wallace. Hendricks felt a chill. The task force quietly placed him under surveillance. They collected a discarded coffee cup from a trash bin outside a grocery store. Forensics rushed the analysis. The result came back within days, a full match. The male DNA on the duct tape, once degraded, hidden, unreachable, now had a name attached to it. Marcus Dean Wallace, a man who had walked among the grieving. A man who had kept his head down. A man who had for nearly 2 decades evaded justice by inches. But this time science had caught up to him. Would the suspect's DNA confirm it? Or would the trail go cold again? When news broke in the spring of 2023 that an arrest had been made in the 2003 cold case murder of Kayla Morgan Whitfield, the town of Brookridge was stunned. But no one was prepared for the name that followed Marcus Dean Wallace. Age 42, occupation local handyman, former volunteer during the early search for Kayla, resident of Brookridge for most of his adult life. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't an outsider. He was one of them. In the days following Kayla's disappearance, Marcus had joined community search parties. He'd passed out flyers, spoken with police, even lit a candle at the vigil outside North Ridge High. There were photographs of him from that night, arms folded, eyes down, standing beside grieving parents. Now, 2 decades later, he was in handcuffs. The DNA match had been verified twice. The coffee cup discarded in a grocery store parking lot contained saliva that exactly matched the degraded sample recovered from the duct tape near Kayla's body. That piece of evidence, once insignificant, had become the smoking gun. When officers approached Wallace at his home, he didn't run. He didn't resist. He asked calmly if he could put on his shoes. Then he turned around, wrists behind his back, and said only 4 words, "It's been a while." Within hours, the charges were made public. First-degree murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. People were shocked. Wallace had no criminal record beyond minor traffic citations. He lived a quiet life in a modest home. He was often seen walking his dog or chatting with cashiers at the local hardware store. He volunteered once a month at the town food bank, but neighbors quickly began to re-examine everything. One woman recalled seeing Wallace working construction near Wild Hollow Trail in 2003. Another said he once made a comment that girls that age think they know everything. They hadn't thought much of it at the time. The town was reeling. The idea that a man who had mourned beside them, who had shared their pain, could have been the one who caused it was too much to process. One neighbor told reporters He cried at her memorial. How could he be the one? For Grace and Dennis Whitfield, the arrest was a gut punch. Relief collided with disbelief. All these years they had passed him in grocery store aisles. He had been there at their lowest moments, pretending to grieve, pretending to care. Prosecutors began building their case quickly. Beyond the DNA evidence, they uncovered records showing Wallace had worked odd jobs in the area near where Kayla's car was found. Phone tower data from a deactivated burner phone linked him vaguely to the area the night she disappeared. A former roommate came forward, claiming Wallace came home panicked and dirty on that night in 2003, though he hadn't realized the timing until now. But the defense had their own strategy. Wallace's attorney emphasized his lack of criminal history, his consistent presence in the community, and the possibility of secondary DNA transfer. The duct tape, they argued, could have been mishandled or moved. Presence is not proof, the attorney told reporters. This case will not be tried in the court of public opinion, but on facts, and the facts are murky. The trial was set for early 2024. As the town braced for what would become the most closely watched court case in its history, one question lingered above everything else. Would the jury believe the evidence, or would his clean record cast doubt? The courtroom was silent as the bailiff called the session into order. It was January 8, 2024. Over 20 years since Kayla Morgan Whitfield had vanished into the cold Michigan night. And now, her accused killer sat just feet from her grieving mother. Grace Whitfield walked slowly to the witness stand. Her hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back into a neat bun. She clutched a tissue in one hand and a photograph of Kayla in the other. When she turned toward the jury, her voice trembled, but her eyes held firm. "I want you to know who my daughter was," she said. She wasn't just a name in a file. She was kind, she was brilliant, and she was everything to me. It was the emotional centerpiece of a trial that had captured not just Brookridge, but the entire state. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but updates were broadcast live each day. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse holding candles and signs that read "Justice for Kayla." Over 3 weeks, the prosecution built its case with quiet precision. The star of the forensic argument was the duct tape, preserved from 2003, retested in 2021, and now carrying the full weight of modern DNA science. Experts explained how advanced collection techniques had revealed a partial male DNA profile that, years later, was matched to Marcus Dean Wallace through familial genealogy. Prosecutors walked the jury through the reconstructed timeline. Wallace had lived just 1.3 miles from where Kayla's car was found. He'd worked a landscaping job the week prior near Wild Hollow Trail. His phone, though rarely used, had pinged a tower covering the wooded area on the night of Kayla's disappearance. And then there was the testimony of his former roommate, called to the stand on day 6. He came home late that night, the man said, eyes low. He was sweating, dirty, said nothing except "don't ask." I didn't think much of it, until I saw her face on the news. But the defense came out swinging. They argued that the DNA evidence was inconclusive and circumstantial. The duct tape wasn't found on Kayla, they said. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no direct link placing Wallace at the exact crime scene. They challenged the reliability of the DNA match and suggested cross-contamination could not be ruled out. They painted Wallace as a quiet man with a troubled past. Yes, but not a violent one. He had no reason to harm her, the defense attorney said in closing. There is no motive, no confession, and no physical evidence that definitively ties him to the murder. You are being asked to connect dots that were never drawn. Still, Grace's testimony hung in the air like smoke. She spoke of the night Kayla didn't come home, the unanswered calls, the moment the sheriff knocked on the door, the smell of her daughter's hoodie when they found it in the woods. Her voice cracked only once when she said, "She died alone and he came to her vigil and looked me in the eye." Many jurors wept openly. The final day came. Both sides rested. The courtroom emptied and the jury began its deliberation. Grace sat in the gallery beside Dennis, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Neither spoke. The clock ticked. Hours passed. Then one day. Then another. 21 years had passed. Now 2 more days would decide everything. Would justice finally be served, or would he walk free? On the morning of January 30th, 2024, the jury filed into the courtroom. Every seat in the gallery was filled. The air was thick with breathless silence. As the judge called for order, Grace Whitfield reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple silver chain, the one her daughter used to wear every day, with a tiny feather charm dangling from it. She held it tightly, knuckles white, as the verdict was read aloud. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. Grace let out a breath that seemed to echo across the room. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Kayla." After 21 long years, justice had arrived. Not swiftly, not easily, but fully. The sentencing came weeks later. Marcus Dean Wallace was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. In court, he showed little emotion. No apology. No explanation. For Kayla's family, that silence was just another wound. But it no longer defined the story. Kayla's legacy began to grow almost immediately after the verdict. Media outlets across the country picked up the story. DNA breakthrough solves Michigan cold case after 2 decades. Kayla's photograph, smiling in her cafe apron, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, was everywhere. But she was no longer just the face of tragedy. She had become a symbol of hope. The ripple effects began close to home. The Brookridge Police Department, under public pressure, launched an internal review of all unsolved violent cases dating back to 1980. Officers were retrained in evidence preservation. New cold case procedures were put in place. A task force named the Whitfield Initiative was funded to examine long-dormant files with fresh eyes. But the change didn't stop there. Within months, Michigan legislators introduced the Kayla's Law Act, requiring all law enforcement agencies in the state to retest biological evidence in unsolved violent crimes at least once every 10 years, using the latest available technology. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Grace Whitfield stood on the steps of the state capitol the day it was signed into law. She was going to be a journalist, she said to the cameras. She wanted to shine a light on things that mattered. Maybe this is how she gets to do that, just in a different way. In Brookridge, something beautiful took shape near the Brew House Cafe where Kayla had once worked. A group of students from Northridge High School, most of whom weren't even born when she died, partnered with a local artist to paint a mural in her honor. It stretched across a full brick wall, Kayla's face in warm tones, her journal in hand, surrounded by painted butterflies and a quote from one of her poems. "We are not meant to disappear quietly." People came from nearby towns just to see it. Some left flowers, others left notes tucked under the frame, but all of them felt the same thing, that Kayla's light hadn't dimmed, it had grown. Grace and Dennis visited the mural weekly. They didn't speak much during those visits. Sometimes Grace would just sit on the nearby bench and close her eyes, letting the wind pass gently across her face. In her heart, she believed Kayla was there. The trial may have ended, but Kayla's story was just beginning again. In death, could Kayla spark change for others still waiting? The 2003 Michigan cold case that once shattered a family has now become a symbol of hope, resilience, and long overdue justice.
Kayla Morgan Whitfield's name is no longer just written into the archives of tragedy. It lives on in legislation,
in community reform, and in the hearts of those who never stopped believing. For 21 years, her killer lived among the very people he deceived, showing up at vigils, offering sympathy, even helping to search for the girl he had buried in the woods. But despite the silence, despite the decades lost to grief and frustration, the truth was not erased. It was waiting, in a sealed evidence bag, in the determination of a mother who never let go, and in the tireless efforts of a new generation of investigators who believed in second chances. Kayla's story is a powerful reminder of why we must preserve evidence, revisit the past with better tools, and keep pushing for change in how we pursue justice for the voiceless. From small-town heartbreak emerged statewide legislation. From quiet mourning came louder calls for accountability. Today, Kayla is remembered not for the way she died, but for the way she lived, full of promise, compassion, and creativity. Her poetry, her dreams of journalism, her quiet strength, all have become part of a legacy that stretches far beyond Brookridge. Justice was delayed, but it was not denied. Her light, once dimmed, now shines as a beacon for every family still waiting, every case still unsolved. If you believe in justice for cold cases, share Kayla's story. Someone out there still needs to be found, and someone still needs to be heard.